Good evening. I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening for this important and timely conversation, a virtual panel on anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism in America. My name is Avinoam Patt. I'm the Doris and Simon Conover Chair in Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. I want to thank Dodd Human Rights Impact for hosting our event this evening via Zoom. Had we been on campus, we likely would have been meeting in the Conover Auditorium of the Dodd Center. So Glenn Matoma, director of the Dodd Center, and I have taken to renaming this space the Conover Zoomatorium. I want to extend a special thank you to the UConn Philosophy Department, El Instituto, the Africana Studies Institute, Dodd Human Rights Impact, and the Office of Global Affairs for co-sponsoring this program tonight with our four wonderful guest speakers. And while I have you here, I just want to mention two upcoming programs that may be of interest to this audience. Next Wednesday evening on October 21st, Beryl Lang will deliver the Jean and Georgia Middleman Lecture in Judaic Studies on the topic of Against the Lachrymose View of Jewish History. Again, perhaps a fitting reminder for our discussion tonight, we can discuss the lachrymose reading of history, which is hard to avoid in these times. And on November 9th, in commemoration of Kristallnacht and the closing session of a course on the past, present, and future of anti-Semitism, I will be joined by Professors Dina Grant of the Hartford Seminary and Jonathan Ellikin of Trinity College for a discussion on the past, present, and future of anti-Semitism, an event which will be part of the UConn Center for Judaic Studies Francis and Irving Seliger Memorial Lecture. Now, we know that we are living in a time of rampant anti-Semitism and racism. And this summer, after the senseless killing of George Floyd, the center's institutes and programs at UConn came together to issue a statement on racial injustice and ending white supremacy. We, the faculty and staff of the interdisciplinary center's institutes and programs, expressed our shock, our heartbreak, and our outrage at the horrific and senseless killing of George Floyd and the ongoing violence against Black people. As we noted in our statement, each of the names that we listed there represented a human being dehumanized, rendered invisible, a Black life cut short by brutality and wanton violence. As we said, we cannot look away, we cannot remain indifferent, we cannot be silent. And in our statement, we expressed our resolve to stand together to expose and confront the deep, pervasive, systemic issues that continue to fuel one tragedy after another, and that we would work together to bring real change. As academic units and programs of the university, founded on principles of social justice and human rights, we reaffirmed our commitment to educating the next generation of healers and freedom fighters. This vision of change, which this crisis on top of a catastrophic pandemic in the times in which we're living, calls for broad, systemic, and intergenerational strategy. And as we suggested, we recognized that these changes could not be legislated alone, but needed to be cultivated community by community, day by day. And thus, we reaffirmed our commitment to creating communities of accountability, implementing actions that would dismantle the status quo of white supremacy, and amplifying the voices and experiences of people of color. And I think that tonight's program continues to build on this call to action and education. As we gather here this evening, we also note the disturbing rise of anti-Semitism in this country and around the world. A nexus of political leadership, including that in the White House, equivocating on racism and anti-Semitism, white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups feeling emboldened, online hate speech and racist groups spreading conspiracy theories, fake news, Holocaust denial, and more. October 9th marked the one-year anniversary of the Yom Kippur attack on the synagogue in Halle, Germany. October 27th will mark the two-year anniversary of the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where 11 were killed and 6 were wounded. This past August, we marked the 3-year anniversary of the Unite the Right March of neo-Nazis and white supremacists in Charlottesville, who chanted with their tiki torches, "Jews will not replace us," reflecting a white supremacist worldview that the white race is doomed to extinction by an alleged rising tide of color, quote unquote, purportedly controlled and manipulated by Jews. All of this I offer as context for tonight's discussion with this distinguished panel, who will help us make sense of the current environment and examine the connections between anti-Semitism, racism, and the place of Jews in such conversations. And I want to thank all of the panelists for joining us this evening. This is a conversation that began many months ago when I first connected with Lewis Gordon and said, we have to plan something. And I read something that Jonathan Judaken had published in the foreword, and I said, you have to come up here and speak at UConn. So I'm really grateful to all of you for joining us this evening and for the collegiality in putting this program together. In a moment, I will introduce our panelists for tonight's conversation, and I just want to make a few notes on the format for tonight. After I introduce the panelists, they will each spend approximately 5 minutes offering opening remarks, including some personal background on their relationship to the topic. We will then discuss and interrogate some of the categories of Black and Jewish, racism, and anti-Semitism in a conceptual framing of the discussion, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion with the audience. I just want to note for those of you, everyone is familiar with how Zoom works by now, but you'll see that at the bottom of your screen, you have a chat function and a Q&A function. And you can pose questions for the panelists and for everyone who is here in either of those formats for us to discuss and address. And I'll serve as a moderator and try to bring these questions into the program. Now, I'll introduce all of our panelists now so we can get my intro remarks out of the way. And then they're going to speak in the order which they will be introduced. This is going according to, we decided an order of seniority, shall we say. Our first speaker tonight will be Kal Alston, who is Professor and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Syracuse University. She holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and spent her early career at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in educational policy studies and as director of the Gender and Women's Studies program. Her most recent publications have focused on ethics and community responsibility, the phenomenal experience of race and philosophical practice, and the connection of the Brown decision to contemporary educational experience. She's president of the Philosophy of Education Society, which is an international forum that promotes the philosophic treatment of educational practice, policy, and research, and advances the quality of teaching the philosophy of education. She's currently working on analyses of contemporary girlhood, early adolescent culture and education, and race and fatherhood, as well as the development of women's leadership in academia and in other social contexts. Following Kal, our next speaker will be Lewis Gordon. Lewis Gordon is professor and department head at the University of Connecticut in philosophy. He is editor of the American Philosophical Association blog series Black Issues in Philosophy, and with Jane Anna Gordon, the book series Global Critical Caribbean Thought, as well as the journal Philosophy and Global Affairs. He has produced approximately 100 articles, book chapters, and reviews. I can't list all of the books in the time that we have here. I'll just mention a few. What Fanon Said, A Philosophical Introduction to His Life and Thought in 2015, with Jane Anna Gordon, of Divine Warning, Reading Disaster in the Modern Age, An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, a companion to African American Studies, and many, many other publications, including Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, Fanon and the Crisis of European Man. And he'll probably tell us about his most recent project, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about as well. After Lewis, Jane Anna Gordon. Jane Gordon is professor of political science with affiliations in American Studies at Instituto Global Affairs Philosophy, Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Connecticut. She's a specialist in political theory with a focus on modern and contemporary political theory, Africana political thought, theories of enslavement, political theories of education, and methodologies in the social sciences. She is most recently author of Statelessness and Contemporary Enslavement in 2020, and Creolizing Political Theory, Reading Rousseau through Frantz Fanon. She's co-editor of the forthcoming Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg, and with Cyrus Zirkatzadeh of The Politics of Richard Wright, Perspectives on Resistance. She's also author of Why They Couldn't Wait, a critique of the Black-Jewish conflict over community control in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, among multiple other publications. And our last speaker before we open for general discussion is Jonathan Judaken. Jonathan Judaken, sorry, Jonathan, I've just lost your bio, is the Spence L. Wilson Chair in Humanities, professor of history. His research focuses primarily on how intellectuals represent Jews and Judaism and race and racism. His research seeks to understand the patterns that underpin race thinking, as well as those that lead to respect and responsibility for others. His work ranges across the history of existentialism, the critical philosophy of race, critical theories of anti-Semitism, and post-Holocaust French thought. He's the author of Jean-Paul Sartre and the Jewish Question, Anti-Semitism and the Politics of the French Intellectual. He's been editor of a collection entitled Race After Sartre, Anti-Racism, Africana Existentialism, Post-Colonialism, another volume, Naming Race, Naming Racisms, and his most recent project is Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism, Confronting Modernity and Modern Judeophobia. And again, our order of presenters this evening will start with Kal, then Louis, then Jonathan, and then Jane will be our last introductory speaker before we open for discussion. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn it over to Kal Alston.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank, first of all, Avinoam and Louis for including me in this hootenanny tonight. And like all of us, I'm sure we would really prefer to be together in the same room where we can look one another in the eye and hear the breath of those that we're speaking with and to, but really appreciate UConn for putting this panel together. And I would also just say that I lived a long time without being the senior, the most elder person. So I'm stepping into my moment of elder wisdom, and we'll see what you think about that. And at this moment, and maybe particularly at this moment, I'm realizing and being constantly reminded that I cannot really do my work without interrogating who I am and where I come from. And that self-interrogation is the way that I have to defend against communities and a world that does not seem to love me in my entirety. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s with movement parents, a father who was a minister in the United Church of Christ. You can read that as a liberal lefty, who took us to and hosted what were then in the 60s, late 60s, called ecumenical seders, and who moved us to a community that was where we were the only Black family in our neighborhood. But I went to school with many, many Jewish classmates and was interpolated into that community as a child, and then chose it as an adult. What I see from my particular perch is a set of intergenerational ruptures that disconnect younger generations from the civil rights generation, under the accusation of respectability politics, and then also I encounter young Jews who are disconnected from the traditional uses of anti-Semitism to shore up flights to assimilation and passing. So that history of coalition and its contemporary challenges are sometimes difficult to see, to parse, and to critique, and to activate as weapons against the contemporary moves of white supremacy, to, as Avinoam mentioned, the march in Charlottesburg, which was ostensibly to protect the statues of the Confederacy, but also took the time to mark that Jews will not replace us, in a way that I think was probably surprising to many contemporary folks, but really resonated strongly with me. And so I want to, I'll just close with the idea that I continually am looking not at a double consciousness, but maybe a quadruple or a quintuple consciousness that guides my my view on the world, and my continuing willingness to enter into conversation with people who both misunderstand history and maybe understand it better than I do in some facets, and to engage in that conversation across multiple identities.
So Lila Tov, given the times, Shabbat Shalom, Machia Vanakan, I add that's Tamil for pretty much the same thing. And good evening, everybody. Thank you, many of you have taken time to join us this evening. And as well, we're living in such terrible times that I know that there are people who are logged on, who have lost people, not only to COVID-19, but also many other difficulties of the time, whether they're health difficulties, and also there are people who are losing people from everything from police violence to domestic violence. So my condolences to all of you. I'm going to begin by an observation. And that observation is that many people, when it comes to thinking about issues such as anti-Jewish hatred or anti-Black racism, they believe that their context is the context. So a lot of the things they have to say about Jews is they're talking about their Jews or their society's image of Jews. And it's a similar thing with Blacks. Everybody thinks their Blacks are the Blacks. And I bring this up mainly because a lot of my work, and also just life experience, is global. So one of the things that happens when you go across the globe is you find out that people do things differently elsewhere. They think things differently elsewhere. So I'm just going to make three observations, or rather three reflections, and then we'll continue. The first reflection is the fact that when we say anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, there's a script about how many people talk about these issues. And because the script is primarily today in the context of liberal democracies, there's a tendency to talk about them in ways that seek a form of moral account sheet or moral equivalence or moralistic views about how to deal with them. But what's often erased is the fact that a lot of the problems that we're dealing with are fundamentally political. And this tendency to reduce them simply to moralistic claims individualizes them to the point where we're locked in an endless cycle of blame and repetition instead of addressing the conditions that perpetuate these. So the reflective part comes from the obvious fact that I'm Black and I'm Jewish. And that means that one may wonder what it is to live through the convergence of these, similar to the way Kal just mentioned. But one of the tricky things is being Black and Jewish is not the same everywhere. You see, if you're Black and Jewish in Jamaica, which is the island in which I'm born, the island has a predominantly Black identity. So even if you're the lightest skinned Jamaican or the darkest skinned Jamaican, your identity is as a Black person. So why this is very tricky is a similar thing as this is a context in which being Jewish was not looked at in religious terms, but in heavily racial ethnic terms. In other words, the place I'm from, until very recently, you were just simply born Jewish and that was it. There weren't conversions, there weren't anything. It was, so to be Jewish was looked at in a way that was not only racial ethnic, but it turns out that a lot of things that in my childhood looked at as cultural, because I had no reference point to say religious. For me, religion was what Christians do, you see. So, but I didn't realize that a lot of what we were doing in the US context was ritualistically religious, you see. It was in a way to think of the way a Yoruba or a Igbo or an Akan may do the things they do. However, when I came to the United States as a child, at the age of 9, this is where, at a very concrete level, I experienced two astonishing things. And both of them I write about in a book I just wrote called Fear of Black Consciousness. The first was when I sat down in the 4th grade next to a little boy named Tommy. And the little boy basically, referred to me in the N-word, but I didn't know what the N-word was. Because in the context with Patois in Jamaica, you think of things differently. So when I finally, this guy, what's this guy talking about? Go to talk to some other kids. What the hell is, and there were Black and Puerto Rican kids. They looked at me like, and so when they explained what he was talking about, when I went back down and he said, did you learn anything N? I just grabbed him by the throat, threw him on the ground and just beat the crap out of him. Now, one of the things, I know in this country we love to valorize nonviolence, but I got to tell you, there's something really healthy about beating the crap out of a white guy who calls you nigger. It really is healthy. Fanon is right. And it's funny when the teachers came up and were saying, "Oh my God, didn't expect that from you." I'm like, you should be talking to this dude. Why is it? Why do you? It's fine for him to be doing this, but I'm problematic if I do this anyway. That's one context. But then the next context, the reason I bring this up, of course, is this is the birth of a particular kind of consciousness. And it's what we could call the realization of anti-Black racism. The second one was, again, in Jamaica, I didn't think of Jews as white. You see what I mean? You could be light-skinned or dark-skinned, but you were just Jews. So when I made friends who turned out to be Jews, I was astonished when I saw the other kids threw pennies at them. I'm like, what the hell is this? You know what I mean? And that moment, I began to realize something that is very crucial that we should think about when we talk about anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, because I don't share what a lot of people who talk about anti-Semitism tend to share. In the US, they want to eat their cake and have it too. They want to couch anti-Semitism into an anti-religious position. But most people who hate Jews don't know a damn thing about Jewish religion. When those men were marching in Charlotte, right? When they say Jews won't replace them, remember, they didn't say replace us Christians. They were saying whites. So if white supremacy is an antithesis of what it is to be Jewish, then this is not about religion. This is about the continued racial construction of Jews. So I actually see what's called anti-Semitism as really a category of racism. Now, in this country, it's hard for people to think through this because they are locked into certain racial cliches. But they don't realize that people could belong to the same race, but look like the 5 of us right now. In fact, the 5 of us right now within that framework are Jews. So the thing there that's crucial is just with which I'll close, is many people are not knowledgeable of the history of racism and how much the hatred of Jews is linked to that history. The term race and the racism that accompanies it comes out of what today would be called medieval Spain and Andalusia with the term reza, and it referred to breeds of dogs, cats, Jews, and Moors were Afro-Muslims. So already in the formation of race and racism is a symbiotic connection of today, the way people use the language of Blacks and Jews. And in fact, most racist literature, all the way through to Arthur de Gobineau, the 19th century racist thinker, all the way through, referred to Jews in racial terms. And in fact, some even have called Jews mulattoes. But the basic point is that because it's a human imposition, it's fluid. And what we forget is you can racialize anybody. Once you've racialized them, then things are set in motion. So the crucial thing today is to understand that white supremacy is linked to fascism, and fascism is linked to the eradication of difference. And as we know, particularly 20th century fascism, we know the location of Jews in that discourse in terms of its genocidal efforts. But we also know that by the time it reaches Nazi Germany, it was already having its warm-up in Namibia. And a lot of Nazi Germany was inspired by the activities from the United States of America, not only with its eugenics language, its anti-Black racism, but also its anti-Jewish racism. And I'll say more later, but those are my opening remarks. Thank you.
So I want to just start off by thanking Avi Patt for the invitation, and my old friends and my teachers on this panel. I'm really looking forward to learning and sharing with all of you tonight. And as we've already started to hear, we all come at this topic from the perspective of what Donna Haraway calls situated knowledge. In my case, I grew up in apartheid South Africa. This means that those grainy white and black pictures that all of you know from the segregated South, that was my life in living color. Let me give you one anecdote from my daily life to paint the picture. Dressed up in my school uniform, I would have a proper suit jacket and a tie. I was dropped off at a public school that was obviously all white. There was only one non-Jew in my grade by our Black driver who was not driving Miss Daisy, but driving Master Jonathan. In short, I grew up in a context that was the opposite of diverse and inclusive. It was a colonialist and racist regime that was segregated by design. And then I came to America. Despite speaking the language and coming here as white when I was a teenager, the experience of immigration is always difficult. I was suddenly an outsider who spoke with a funny accent, who wore the wrong clothes, who said the wrong things. And kids are cruel, and they mocked my difference, and they shocked me out of the way that I had been brought up with a real sense of entitlement and centeredness. And those scars shaped me. And they were later reinforced when I went to live in France and didn't speak the language very well when I arrived. And this was true in a different way when I went to live in Israel for 2 years as a postdoctoral before moving to Memphis now more than 20 years ago. These experiences have meant that I always viewed America through what Du Bois called double consciousness, or perhaps more aptly, what Michael Walzer calls the connected critic. My work has been a lot about intellectual responses to anti-Semitism and racism, and it's been shaped by this upbringing. And what I wanted to do in my opening remarks is sort of lay on the table for our conversation some of what I've learned from that in terms of framing our discussion. First of all racisms are entangled. I know from growing up in South Africa and growing old in Memphis that if all I did was to look one-eyed at the history of Jews and Judeophobia in these two places, I could explain very little of my story. I cannot tell my story without accounting for anti-Black racism. Likewise, if all I did in my work on the situation of Jews in France was to consider their situation separate from the history of colonialism in North and West Africa, a history with deep implications for both Muslims and Jews in France today, I couldn't offer a clear account of what's going on there. Now, if we understand that all racisms are entangled, then by extension, this also means that anti-Semitism is not unique or exceptional. Lewis already spoke a little bit about this. I just would add to it by saying Jews and Jewish history are necessarily a part of a larger interconnected story that we cannot evaluate by looking at it one-eyed. Apropos of the novelist Chimamanda Adichie, we must not be blinded by the danger of a single story. Second, I cannot tell my story without acknowledging the privileges of whiteness. It's completely bound up with Jewish success in South Africa in the most obvious ways. Whiteness gave Jews rights and privileges so obviously denied to coloreds, Asians, and Blacks. Whiteness eliminated the competition from 80% of the population. Likewise, you simply cannot tell the story of Jews' realization of the American dream without talking about whiteness. To grapple as Jews with the issue of anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism in America entails that we consider the history of whiteness and white privilege. Following from what I've said about white privilege, I've also come to appreciate something about white supremacy. I want us to understand that it takes two forms. There is the white supremacy of neo-Nazis marching with tiki torches, chanting, "Jews will not replace us," or neo-Confederates rallying around the symbols of the Confederacy. There's the white supremacy of white robes and hoods and burning crosses, swastikas, and white Christian terrorists gunning down Jews at Sabbath services. But when Black Lives Matter activists talk about the systems, institutions, and structures that are strangling Black lives, that are the daily knee on the neck, in the pipeline to prison, in the disparities that afflict Black and brown people with the new coronavirus, in the inequalities of wealth and access in corporate America, in the lack of educational success, and in so many other social indicators that sociologists call social facts, what they are pointing to is the other face of white supremacy. Lastly, I've come to understand from Albert Memmi that racism operates on three levels: the individual, social, and political levels. And this means that we have to confront Judeophobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and what Frantz Fanon called negrophobia. To confront them, we also have to do that on three levels. Individually, we have to check ourselves. We have to interrogate our story. We have to explore our conscious and unconscious biases and consider how we fit into the racial caste system where we live. Secondly, on the social level, it's about learning more history, developing a critical vocabulary, learning more social facts, immersing ourselves in conversations with people who do not share our background, our skin color, or religion, and ultimately transmitting to our children, to our family, to our friends and our colleagues, our respect and appreciation for difference. Finally, it's about politics, as Lewis said. With less than 20 days before the election, we know that it's about national politics, but it's also about the politics of the local. It's about the diversity of our organizations at the highest levels of management and about what people are paid at the lowest levels for their labor. My hope for this evening is that as we consider anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism in America, we do so while considering how all racisms are entangled, how they intersect with the history of whiteness and white supremacy, and what we can do about it.
So hello, I also wanted to begin by thanking Avi and Lewis for organizing this discussion, and I'm delighted to be with both of you and Kal and Jonathan. I had slightly misunderstood the assignment for our opening comments, and they're much more autobiographical than they probably should be. But I hope you'll bear with me because many of the themes are ones that parallel some that have already been raised in addition to raising some new ones. So my parents are descendants of 4 different strands of family that moved from Europe to South Africa in the mid-19th and in the late 19th century. The Jews, so far as we know, were a combination of Iberian Jews, presumably Sephardi from Portugal and Spain, who fled to Belarus during or soon after the Inquisition. And on my dad's side, they were Jews who lived in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, and they were Yiddish-speaking Jews involved in socialist Zionist circles in Vilna, Lithuania. I emphasize that simply because there were, of course, many other Jews in South Africa, most significantly the Lemba Jews of South Africa and Zimbabwe, and also Sephardi Jews who left, especially Portugal, for the African continent much earlier than my family did. And because my parents were both only children and immigrants 2 or 3 times over, my brother and I grew up traveling between Chicago in the US and Cape Town, where our grandparents lived. So this meant moving between 2 profoundly segregated places, and also 2 places that were marked as profoundly by struggles for social and racial justice. And so in a non-dogmatic way, I grew up absolutely prizing heroes of the larger anti-apartheid struggle, whether Steve Biko or Chris Hani. But I especially idolized, and that really is the right word, journalists and intellectuals and lawyers who had made commitments to fighting apartheid primary, and who saw that commitment and that work as the primary expression of their Jewishness. So in a formative and pretty pre-reflective way, that just seemed right. And when I moved to Chicago, I met and learned about similar kinds of Jewish intellectuals and activists there. They didn't really think of or they wouldn't have described themselves as allies to causes of racial justice. They simply saw the work of racial justice as the work that they were to do, that those were tasks that people like us were engaged in because they were necessary. And some of those people were married to Black men or women and had Black families. And they saw what they were doing as just continuing a long history of struggle against unfreedom that took on new forms in the US or in other contexts. So for them, being Jewish didn't mean a narrow ethnic nationalist identity. It meant moving again and again and finding and working and mixing with your people, where your people were largely defined by shared commitments or project and also shared sources of joy and fulfillment. But I would say that my racial consciousness was profoundly shaped by my encounters with Judaism. Unlike most of my peers, I was born in '76, whose families had been in the US for several generations, I genuinely loved the formative experiences I had with Judaism. You know, they included Jewish socialist Zionist camp in England. Once my grandparents had passed, we often spent time with South African Jewish family in England. And this particular youth group, Haponim Dror, was the one that my dad had grown up in South Africa. And through them, I learned actually to be quite critical of Israel, to be very familiar and fond of socialist ideas, and the importance of developing a critical historical consciousness. But in some ways, more significantly, I grew up in a shul that really conveyed the gravity of what it meant to call oneself a Jew. And given that much of my family was, you know, in different countries and in different continents, I felt the presence of people who were very far away when we would sing particular melodies or read particular passages of liturgy. And I found myself genuinely challenged by messages in the Torah. So for instance, when there were instructions that we had been strangers and about how one should treat strangers, and that there should be one law for citizens and non-citizens alike, or economic ideas like Jubilee, where there are systematic periods of debt forgiveness, or what it was to leave the corners of one's fields for people who would come by who were inevitably hungry. But in terms of racial consciousness, there was also this whole idea of having been enslaved and having been a people that lived in North Africa and West Asia. And, you know, I am pretty bookish, but this really kept me up at night. I really liked the idea that for an exiled and dispersed people, the Torah was literally our homeland. Instead of a geographical territory, our peoplehood was kept alive through our continued engagement in critical study of the sacred text. But obviously the people in the Torah did not look like me. They would have been brown people, more like the people fighting segregation than those benefiting from it. And so when I learned that there were Jews of color, this made much more sense. But I really wanted to know how I became genealogically connected to these early African and West Asian people and what that linkage meant, especially when combined with stories about enslavement and then living in exile. And I imagined that maybe my curly hair was a faint trace of an actual biological tie of this multiracial race that Lewis was discussing before. And so when I learned later of stories of German Jews who had a lot of melanin, who when they moved to the United States pass not as white, but as light-skinned Black people in Black communities, this other trajectory, which was rarely spoken about, made a good deal of sense to me. And I learned much more recently of similar stories in South Africa of Jews who lived in primarily colored and also Black residential areas like District 6 in Cape Town. So in close, I've always been particularly interested in leftist progressive Jews. The number of these in urban centers in the US in the 20s and 30s were large. The numbers have grown smaller, in large part because of the upward mobility afforded to many lighter-skinned Jews through liberal gains of the civil rights movement, but there really are still some who remain. And if their numbers are smaller, they're still here, and there's a community that celebrates them as exemplary Jewish people. They've not seen lighter Jews as doing Black people a favor through working in alliance. If anything, in the world they seek, or we seek, Black people are more obviously the political vanguard. And so while they don't deny the fact of anti-Semitism, they refuse to treat it as exceptional or as radically unique, and insist on thinking about it in relationship to other forms of racism and xenophobia, as Jonathan was saying, and see fighting for the safety of Jews as strengthening relations with other vulnerable people.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you all of you for starting us with such fascinating sort of both reflections and observations. I'm going to ask a question, but I also want to give you time to respond to each other, and then we already have fascinating questions coming into the Q&A in the chat, so we'll get to those next. But you all begin to address some of the conceptual overlaps, or sort of deconstruct these categories of Black and Jewish and racism and anti-Semitism. And as you all suggest, context really matters, right? Both in terms of background, both in terms of upbringing, both in terms of the way that our worldviews are shaped. All of these things really matter. And we each, as each of you have done, bring our own individual perspectives to how we interpret these categories. I'm wondering, and I'll ask this question specifically in the American context, and I know we already have questions coming in that bring up Israel, for example, and other geographic contexts, but Jonathan talked about sort of how we take this knowledge, both in terms of your individual experiences and your backgrounds and deconstructing the conceptual categories, how we take this knowledge of sort of how interconnected and messy these categories are and apply it very specifically to the present day context of what we're dealing with here today in America in 2020, right? How do we take this knowledge and sort of translate it, as I'm sure many of our students who are here and want to know about, how do we translate this academic knowledge into activism in a sense? And I'm wondering, and I want to also give you a chance to comment on each other's remarks, but also to think about the moment today. And whoever wants to go first, Kal, go ahead.
I hear your question referring to Jonathan's, but I actually am going to refer to Jane, because I think one of the places that I heard in my three colleagues' spaces is this, you know, there's individual, there's social, there's political. And I think what I heard in Jane's comments that really resonated was this idea that race isn't so much marked on the individual, or race can be elided in some ways in the individual, and that it is actually a social space in which you find solidarity with others, whether it's through your curly hair or through a certain set of privileges. And I think that, going back to something I just referenced, is this idea of passing, and when that's held out as a lure to people to get privilege. And that's one of the tricks I think that white supremacy holds in its midst, is to suggest that you could join us in our power and our glory if you would just give up the accoutrement of your individualized race or ethnicity, but also leave behind that that other community that you thought you belonged to. And so I think the question of the ways in which white supremacy works through both anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism one of the tactics is to separate our collective interests, even when those are deeply in the bone, as I think the experiences of everybody on the panel suggest.
Yeah. I was going to add to that. Oh, I'm sorry. Should I have done this way? But okay. One of the things I didn't. There were three things I'd like to bring up. One of the things I didn't bring up, though I just referred to being Jewish, I didn't also refer to what kind of Jew. And this is the reason I bring this up is when I made the remark about many people's think their Jews are the Jews. What dominates the understanding of Judaism in the Jewish people in the United States is the construction of a white identity, and specifically Ashkenazic Judaism. And a lot of people forget there are also Black Ashkenazi Jews. But the background I'm from, they were Mizrahim Jews from Jerusalem. Through my mother's father's family, my mother's mother's family were Irish Jews. They were Sephardim. Okay, they were Sephardic Jews. And I bring that up mainly because one of the issues when we talk about whiteness is that we have a double issue. We have how white supremacy responds to Jewish people, but we also have a problem within Jewish people of Jews who invest in whiteness. This is hinted at in what Jonathan was saying. And the problem about investing in whiteness, the US has a very specific logic of how one becomes white. And the logic of how one becomes white is it's almost it's a formula. One has to have a kind of conflict with Blacks through which a location is placed that distances oneself from Blacks. And this is very crucial because, as you've seen in my early remarks, the category of the racialization of Jewish people and the racialization of Black people came out of the same root. So the effort for Jewish people to be separated from that root, and it's been part of a long history in the colonies, not only the United States, but in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, an effort to separate and gain what would be considered full citizenship was premised upon a highly racialized encounter. Now, where this becomes very tricky is how we talk about, in some of my writings, I'm very critical about how we talk about, say, whiteness. And one of the reasons is I'm a critic of what people call the privilege discourse. And the reason I'm a critic of the privilege discourse is because privileges can be good. For instance, but the kind of things that come from whiteness is very different. Whiteness is the radicalization of license. And what I mean by that is the difference between a license and a privilege. It's incoherent to say, I have the privilege of harming you. I have the privilege of stealing from you. I have the privilege of lynching you. That doesn't make sense. But the license is what gives you the opportunity to get away with whatever you want in relation to a certain group of people. And if we look at the history of white supremacy, there are people who could lynch, they could butcher a person and pose for the picture while doing this, and they're perfectly fine. And in fact, what whiteness does as a license is to create a doubled reality, a doubled system of justice, a doubled everything. So there are many things that white people are able to do, especially in regard to Black people, that places them in a position in relation to Black people above law. This is why police officers, for instance, who are engaged in the violence, they take the position not that they're to enforce the law. They take the position they are the law, which paradoxically places them above it. One of the reasons the privilege discourse gets a certain cachet is because we're in a period of neoliberalism and neoconservatism, and what they're interested in doing is eroding away the rights that everybody should have. So when it comes to certain issues, if we're talking about justice, healthcare, being treated right with education, et cetera, those are things, the issue for me is not that white people have them. The issue is that white people are blocking other people from getting them. There's certain things all human beings should have. And that element, if Jews who are able to become white in their identity play a role in that, and unfortunately, that's been the role of neoconservative Jews, that becomes a real problematic situation. But if we come now, my last point here, if we come into Black Lives Matter, and Jonathan brought up some of this, the thing that's really crucial, and this is what Jane was alluding to as well, the truth is there have always been Jews of any kind, Ashkenazi, Kaifeng, Koshin, Sephardic, Mizrahi, who, as Jews, regard themselves as fighting for what's right. And I've always argued that those Jews never left the struggle. The thing about it is just that today, all those Jews are to the left, and we're in a country that is demonizing the left. So what happens is, what's elided is that Black Lives Matter is actually a fight also for democracy. And I think what's very different is if you look at some of the past struggles, there's a way in which particularly European Jews were involved. But I think what's different today is that there are people who are also not Jews, but who are white, who are involved in this kind of struggle. And I think they're involved with it precisely because of the fascism, because what's at stake right now, and that's because Black people have functioned as a canary in a coal mine around this, and in Europe, that's the location of Jewish people. What's at stake is that we're dealing with a war against democracy, and those of us who are fighting against that are fighting for democracy. So the fight against anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, and the fight for the question of Black Lives Matter is ultimately a fight for democracy.
Go ahead, Jonathan. Just unmute yourself, Jonathan.
I hate how often I do that. What I started to say was, I guess we'll just continue in the same order that we presented our remarks, which sort of makes sense. I just wanted to bounce off a few things. I want to start off, first of all, with something that I think is actually a really important take home, at least for some people who are listening to us, and it's to echo back in a different form the last point that Louis just made, which is that Jews are to Europe what Blacks are to the United States. That is, this is the primary other around which the central dominant identity has been constructed over the entire course of that civilization. Okay, Jews are to Europe what Blacks are to America. I want to push back on a couple of things that Louis said, or just slightly take a slightly different position, but because I think actually the discourse of privilege, at least the ways in which I've learned about it, is useful. And the way in which I've learned about it is primarily through the work of Albert Memmi. The most recent project that I've got is a book coming out that is a compendium of Memmi's writing. If you aren't familiar with Albert Memmi's work, you should be. Part of what we can do is make some suggestions about reading material. And in particular, his most famous book called The Colonizer and the Colonized. And in the beginning of The Colonizer and the Colonized, part of what he does is to argue that only an economic understanding of colonialism doesn't get us into the full depths of an understanding of the colonial relationship. And he develops a theory about colonialism built around the idea of privilege. And he argues that privilege is something that is, it is multifaceted. It works on many, many different intersecting levels. It is economic. There are economic privileges. Who gets hired first? We know about, for example, unconscious bias when it comes to hiring practices in the United States. And if you have a traditionally African-American name, you're more likely not to have your resume read or to have it paused. Who gets fired first? It works the same way in France if you have a Muslim name, by the way. but it's also social, it is cultural, it is political, it's an intersecting series of licenses, to build on what Lewis said. The other important thing in Memmi is that privilege is always something that is relative and relational. It is not absolute. So for example, one of the things that we have clearly exploded, I think, just in virtue of who has spoken on this panel and our biographies, is the notion of that Jewishness equals whiteness. That has to be exploded simply in virtue of who is talking tonight. And yet nonetheless, in some of the ways in which identity politics plays out, that reflexive association is made. Jews are white because whiteness is about power, and Jews have power, which in a funny way actually echoes one of the most enduring anti-Semitic stereotypes, which is the association of Jews and power. At the same time, that part of what we have to acknowledge, and I said this in my opening comments, is the privilege and that whiteness opened up for Jews in the United States, and that has been central to Jews becoming the quintessential minority when it comes to the embodiment of the American dream and what's possible. So on the basis of that, I just want to say that one kind of useful reading when it comes to this, when it comes to the issue of Jews and whiteness, the book to read is Eric Goldstein's The Price of Whiteness. This is the best book on the subject. But Nell Painter's book, more generally, A History of White People, is really helpful when it comes to understanding the ways in which whiteness has expanded over the course of time and has become more inclusionary. She ends with the issue of whether or not Hispanics are going to be the next group that will be included into the envelope of whiteness. And one thing, though, that is definitely the case, and again, this is something that Lewis said, is that Lewis or Kal, simply because of their skin color, could not, I don't think, could pass into that concept of whiteness. And that's the way in which anti-Black racism has been central to the history of America, okay? And I want to kind of end these comments with going back to something that Kal said in her opening comments, which I thought was really, really important and powerful. And that is, she said, I don't speak from the perspective just of a double consciousness, again, echoing Du Bois, but a triple or a quadruple or a quintuple consciousness. And I think it's the case that really, if you listened to all of our, you know, little tiny nuggets of our stories, none of us have an essential identity. All of our identities, if we tell our stories honestly and openly, are much more complicated than whiteness. Being white is not the only thing that defines my story, which is part of the reason why I hate checking those boxes on forms. We are forced into the assumption of essentialist identities, oftentimes when our identity is challenged. But it seems to me the real thing that we need to deconstruct is precisely the notion that anyone has an essential identity. And we need to therefore open ourselves up to the multiplicity of kinds of identities, the kind of multiplicity of consciousness that Kal talked about, because that's true for every person on this panel, but it's true for every person that's listening tonight as well.
Thanks. Avi, I'm going to try to return to your question more directly, I hope, but it's a hope. So a few things. I mean, given that the panel is about anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism, I was thinking about this assignment that I was given as an undergraduate when I was studying the comparative history of American slavery, right? And I was taking a class with Professor Rhett Jones, beloved late Professor Rhett Jones. And he asked us to do this thing, which we all thought was crazy, which is he asked us to rank the cruelty of the slavery practiced by different European empires in the Americas. And to be completely honest, I had no idea how to respond. I mean, my view is they're all slavery, they're all dehumanizing, they're all cruel. Why am I gonna rank them? It seemed like a perverse exercise. But his whole point was to challenge us, right? In saying, yes, all of these are perverse, but the kind of perversity, the specific forms of their perversity determines how to fight them, how to try to undo them, and the residues that they'll leave behind, right? And so I think that there's a lesson from that for thinking about anti-Semitism. And there's something I want to say about it, but I think there are a couple things I want to say before those things. So the first is, I mean, I think it goes without saying among us, but it doesn't necessarily go without saying beyond us, I'm certain, which is that there are many people who treat any criticism of the state of Israel as anti-Semitic. And that's dead wrong. Right? I mean, the idea, there can be criticisms of the state of Israel that are expressions of anti-Semitism. There can be criticisms of it that are expressions of anti-Semitism, but Israel is a modern nation state. I mean, saying that it's off limits to criticize it doesn't only further empower right-wing leadership in that country, it also creates a major obstacle to progressive politics of solidarity between Jews and non-Jews, right? I mean, the equivalent would be saying you can't criticize the US because it's anti-white. There are anti-white ways of criticizing the US, but there are plenty of ways to criticize the US that couldn't be construed as anti-white, or it wouldn't be helpful to construe them as anti-white, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is where our generational differences may be pertinent, right? Is I'm not from a family that was directly touched by violent anti-Semitism. It propelled the movement of some of my family from Europe to South Africa. But during World War II, we weren't in Europe. The only folks from my family who were in Europe during World War II were helping to fight, you know, in London and in Edinburgh. They're my mom's parents, right? And when I was growing up, I was constantly aware that there were very powerful Jewish organizations that were very well organized and very attentive, always on the lookout for any signs of anti-Semitism, because it was a real threat and it had been a real threat, and disaster could strike and it could strike quickly. But as far as I was concerned, disaster was striking all around me already. It just wasn't hitting Jews. And it seemed crazy that that didn't stir the kind of concern and the kind of mobilization that was always at the ready if there was anti-Semitism. So for instance, I mean, I grew up in Chicago, there were plenty of lives being violently cut short or prematurely foreclosed. And the fact that they weren't Jewish lives, to me, it was completely irrelevant. So I mean, so there's an extent to which when contemporary generations of students have a hard time understanding the kind of register and tenor with which we talk about anti-Semitism, there's an extent to which I get that. And share that even, without at all saying that we should diminish its significance, right? But then the next thing I just had wanted to say, and the reason I began with the Rhett Jones example, is I do think that there's a difference between anti-Semitism on the left and on the right, right? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, anti-Semitism on the right is just proto-racism or racism, right? They're people who see Jews as non-Christian, as Lewis was saying, they see that as a racial formation. So the lighter ones of us are surreptitiously passing so we can, you know, pollute things and, you know, whatever the crazy conspiracy theories are. But for a lot of those Jews, for a lot of those people who hate Jews or those anti-Semites, hating Jews is really like a gateway drug. You know, I mean, it's just the passageway into hating all kinds of other people who are much more vulnerable than many Jews are. And I do think that's really different from left-wing anti-Semitism, which is often a criticism of a failure to be sufficiently in solidarity. And so it's not to say that the criticisms are always launched in the most sophisticated or sympathetic tones, but there's something in them that I find completely compelling and a very important challenge. So for instance, when people say, you know, why can't you engage with the problems that are going on in Israel? I mean, why can't you engage with the question of Palestinian rights? That's a completely legitimate question, as far as I'm concerned. And so I think the rush to collapse all anti-Semitism into the same and to say that we need to just treat all of them as bad really misses the kind of political resources we need if we're going to respond in a way that's constructive.
Thank you, Jane. So, Jonathan, I see your finger, and I just want to, we're going to come back and enable everyone to respond to each other, but I also want to address a number of the excellent questions that are coming in the Q&A and the chat. And I will say that there is a function also for the panelists that if you want to type in a response to a question that might come as directed to you, or you have a thought about it, you can do that as well. But I'll try to fold in some of the really interesting questions that have come in the Q&A and the chat into our discussion as well. And Jane started to raise, and there's one of the first questions that came in, has to do with this question of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and Israel. And Jane started to address this issue, and I'm curious to hear everybody else's thoughts on this as well. And I'll just expand on it a little bit, because I think a lot of what you're all pointing to is also sort of how we need to expand our definition of Jewishness, which we've talked about quite a bit. But when you add in the Israel context, we also have to address the fact that there is a great deal of racism in Israel too, not just against Palestinians and Israeli Arabs and Palestinian, but also against Mizrahi Jews, against Jews who came from North Africa, from the Middle East, from Yemen. That is sort of an essential part of Israel's coming to terms with its past that still hasn't been dealt with either. Or more recently, when I was there last summer, and there was a police-involved shooting of an Ethiopian Israeli, right? So this is an issue that sort of is in Israel, and it complicates everything. So one of the things that I want to make sure that we address is both sort of the racism of Jews that exists in Israel, and then, as Jane alluded to, this question of how we sort of parse out what is anti-Semitism versus what is anti-Zionism. And somebody else asked about Islamophobia also, and sort of, there's a lot to bring in together, but I'll leave it at that and ask you to respond either to each other or that, and then we'll come back to some more questions. And Jonathan, I saw you already had a finger up, so if you want to go.
Yeah, I'll just use the additional question as an opportunity, although I'm not completely sure I'm going to wind back, because I only raised one finger, and we said that's code for following a stream, not changing the topic with our hand. But I want to, I'll answer nonetheless the question, but there was a really important point that Jane made that I just wanted to highlight and have us think about. And that is, so one of the things that a lot of my work has been about is the conceptual terms that we use to discuss this issue. And one of the things that I have written about is that actually the term anti-Semitism gets in the way of these discussions, because it collapses everything from stereotypes, even if they come in the form of, Jews have global power, to to discrimination, the social and legal mechanisms by which we actually include or exclude certain people, to genocide. It's as if you utter a stereotype, you have genocidal, there's a genocidal logic at work in what you're doing. And the reiteration of a stereotype doesn't make you an anti-Semite. Like, that's not what the people in who were at the Unite the Right rally were doing. They don't just have stereotypes, they have a worldview that's completely shaped by their understanding of Jews and Blacks and Mexicans and Latinos and other immigrants. It's shaped by that experience. What Jane said that was really, really important is, or at least that I heard, is that one of the differences between anti-Black racism in America and Judeophobia in America, Judeophobia is the term that I prefer for a number of reasons, is that Judeophobia in America is not and never has been institutionalized. It is not systemic. It is not a structural factor that shapes the daily experience of Jews in the United States. That's a really important thing to pay attention to. Unlike the experience of Jews, let's say in the Middle Ages or even going into the modern period, where there was structural, systemic, institutionalized mechanisms of excluding Jews. And the other, so to turn to the question now about anti-Zionism, this is again to echo what it is that Jane was saying before. There's a difference between the historical record in terms of what the implications of the discourse on the right are vis-a-vis Jews, which has led to violence and death, and the discourse of some on the extreme left whose discourse is sometimes shaped by anti-Zionism. Most of the time articulated as a vehement critique of the state of Israel in ways that do not, in fact, correlate to historically anti-Semitism. Again, they may echo some stereotypes, historical stereotypes about Jews, but that doesn't mean their worldview is shaped by a particular argument about the role of Israel, let's say, in the global context. In some cases, it may be. If you think that Israel is the puppet master controlling the world, well, then you've in fact slipped over into a discourse that historically is anti-Semitic. That's not the way in which most anti-Zionists actually articulate their critique of Israel. So I think that it's really important to make very clear that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism is a complete dead end in terms of these conversations. In much the same way that I think simply reducing Israel to the claim that it equals a racist, colonialist, apartheid state, as one hears, those are a series of analogies that have to be worked out and that have to be developed, okay? And then just looking at the question again, as it came to us about anti-Arab racism in Israel, the claim that Israel is racist. Yes, this is a really important thing that we unquestionably have to acknowledge. And I can't remember now if it's Avi or Jane who talked about anti-Black racism in the ways in which it's being visited against Ethiopians, or historically, it was you, Avi, or historically the kind of secondary status that Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews had within Israel, which I don't think any longer exists. But since we're talking about America, I do at least want to say, that's in the title of the panel, anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, anti-Persian racism amongst Jews in the United States, this is a really serious, wide problem. I know from my own family, I know from conversations that I have, all the time. And so part of what we have to do to move forward is begin a process of taking seriously within our own house some of these kinds of problems.
Kal, I see your finger is up. Go ahead.
I know that Jonathan is our resident historian, but I think I do want to take a little bit of issue with the idea that Jews are not haven't been institutionally or structurally excluded from American life. I mean, maybe it's because I'm in education, and so I am invested in both the history of institutions of education, and I'm teaching a course right now about education as transformation, and a large part of that course is around Americanization and how different groups were able to or not able to completely ingest the concept of being an American. And I think one of the things that is it goes back to something I think that Lewis said at the very beginning, where he thinks most of the kind of white supremacy groups currently in America don't have any consciousness of what Jewish religion is. And so it is this sort of cultural discussion. But there is, in fact, a very firm through line in which a specific religion is incorporated into the notion of the republic. And those people who do not fit into those structures were systematically excluded from structures that included things like, that we can flip into Islamophobia as well. You eat differently than we do, and therefore we do not acknowledge those, not eating pork, those kinds of things. But also, I worked in a law firm in New York City called Skadden Arps, and it was founded on the principle that no white shoe firm in New York City would hire a Jew or an Irish person. And that was, the Irish person was not because they weren't white, obviously, it was because they were Catholic. And so I think there are structural pieces, many of which have fallen away, but I went to Dartmouth College, and my pediatrician, who was Jewish, when I was the person who interviewed me, and I think half the reason he really wanted me to go to Dartmouth was because in 1953, when he was there, he was in the first group of Jews who were admitted to the college. And I think those, I just wanted to push back gently on the idea that there's, that it's simply a matter of stereotyping. I actually think there are structures built around this idea that we are, and we hear it now very loudly, we are a Christian nation, we hold certain values, and that's what undergirds we're a white Christian nation, and that's what undergirds our republic and our view of what democracy should look like, if I go back to Lewis's original point.
Lewis, do you want to respond or pick up on that?
I was taking an opportunity to type into some of the questions others asked.
Yeah,
that way more people could speak.
Thank you. And Lewis is an excellent.
So I'll continue doing that. I'll come back. Why don't Jane? Why don't you come in? Well, some of you, I don't know if others may have seen some of my responses. I was just in the one around Crown Heights, but the short thing for some of the responses I was writing, for some of you may not have seen them, because I don't see some of mine coming up here. One of them was to Feroz Manji's question about anti-Arab racism in Israel. And one of the things that there are several things I brought up. The first thing I brought up was just that one problem. I have a lot of problems with the way we talk about discourses of hate in the United States. And this is something that's spilled over, also connected to certain issues of liberal democracy. And what that is the idea of substituting political subjects with moral subjects. So when we create moral subjects, then we use categories of innocence that require every member of the group to be perfect. Nothing in what we're saying comes down to the position that there are no Jews who are racist, or that there are no Black people who hate other groups of people. It's just part, right? They're human beings, are very complicated, and they're members of groups who do harbor hate. But the complicated thing is that the issue of Israel is that Israel is also linked to a very complex set of strategies developed by neoconservatives on how to argue about Israel. In other words, they set the discourse. And part of the discourse is to set the kind of argument that to have any criticism of Israel is to be anti-Semitic. And this has become so bizarre that it has linked many proponents of Israel with the American right in such a way that what is shocking to show us survivors, or just the fact that, or for those who did just, were rolling over in their graves, is that it has led to a situation. There are people who are so obsessed in transforming Israel into an idol that they'd rather be in a room with Nazis than with Black people or anybody who criticizes Israel, even though those Nazis and the Christian right are just hoping for the day when Jesus will come back and eliminate all Jews. So we're dealing with a very bizarre set of circumstances there. And I think it's oversimplified when we simply talk about Israeli forms of racism, mainly because these are all issues of dealing with settler states, colonial states, and all kinds of issues in which holier than thou racism just doesn't work. When I often remind people, when I speak in South Africa, that I'm coming from the United States, and South Africa was trying to model itself on the United States. So I don't go there as a kind of holier than thou person from the US. And similarly, if we're going to get into some of the other discussions, one of the things I had brought up in the exchange is the reason I bring up license versus privilege is basically this. You see, you can legitimately have a privilege. And it's absurd to tell certain people, it's to the point where the privilege discourse has gotten to the point where I see even Black people who become middle class try to purge themselves of their supposed privilege. However, here's the difference. There's certain license that nobody should have. If someone at your birth gave you a license to be able to kill a group of people, or a license, no matter how ill prepared you are to get the job over somebody who is more achieved than you, and the list is long, you could take a position that it's not right for anyone to have that license. And what's crucial about the license discourse is that once you reject the idea that anybody, including you, who have that license, it now puts you in the position to be able to struggle politically, to work. In other words, the problem with the other discourse is that it's full of moral purging. And so we have a situation where when we're trying to deal with a political action to transform an unjust situation, there are people who get in the room and spend more time arguing about the identity of whether people are morally pure enough, have a lack of sufficient privilege, etc., to belong to the struggle to get rid of that damn license. And so once we understand that, the issue isn't that white people exist. The issue is to wed white people to supremacy. A similar issue is, my argument is not about whether there are Jews who are really white or not. My argument is against the notion that Jews must be white, because that's linked to a discourse that would link whites to those kinds of license through which they can actually stand on the side because there's a systemic structure of power that excludes others. So some people in the thread were asking about actions that people can make. And it seems to me the kind of issues we're talking about requires everybody being able to act. And once we create an identity structure that's going to block certain people as legitimately being able to act, then we're going to undermine what is involved in getting rid of that particular conception. For instance, the notion of whiteness as a license. There's a lot more that I was talking about. Somebody asked about the Crown Heights situation, but a lot of people, Jane actually wrote about the conditions that led up to that before in her Why They Couldn't Wait book. But a lot of people don't understand, again, in this country, people like to say blacks and Jews, but you notice even in this conversation, it's really important. What do you mean by Jews? Are you talking about Sephardim, Mizrahim? Are you talking about Kaifong? Are you talking about Lemba? The list is long. Even with Ashkenazim, there's so many different kinds of Ashkenazic Jews. Similar with Black people, Crown Heights was a heavily Caribbean neighborhood. So the Black people they're talking about, some of those Black people were actually Jews. And then there are other things that are going on in the long gradations. One of the issues I have, for instance, with American Black Studies is American Black Studies wants to have a stereotype of Black people. It wants what a friend of mine, Paul Taylor, used to call Negro studies, which is it wants to have stuff that fit lots of Hollywood stereotypes of Black people. But Black people in the United States is a fluid, ongoing, dynamic phenomenon. And even the Black people who may even meet imagined image themselves are going through transformations along the way. And the same thing is happening with many Jewish people. And just to just end very quickly, where I see it happening quite a lot is with young Jews, because very young Jews are fed up with an understanding of, with what a lot of their parents may have done to try to lock them into this complicit whiteness. Because for them, not only ethically, politically, but also aesthetically, when Jews are linked to the world of color, they find that that understanding of being Jewish is richer. And a lot of young people, I think a lot of young Jews actually love being Jews. So for instance, when I think about me being Black, a lot of the ways we talk about being Black in the United States is in the negative. A lot of people don't understand that I love being a Black person. I don't get up in the morning pissed off when I look in the mirror and say, God, I'm still Black. I love being Black. But it's similarly, there are aspects about being Jewish I love, and that's a longer conversation that's connected to how I talk about ethical life in Judaism. But since I've written on these issues, those who are viewing can easily consult those. So I won't get into details of those. But there are many positive things that we could also talk about being Jewish and being Black. But right now we're talking about people who hate Jews and hate Black, which is why we're focusing on the negative.
So
Jane, go ahead.
I'll touch on what you were asking about Israel, but wanted first to just say something in response to some of what Louis had said, which is when I was referring to left-wing anti-Semitism, one of the things that's very interesting about it is it's never directed at Jews of color. It's very specifically addressed at Jews who either consider themselves white or who are passing as white. And in many ways, what it's saying is, why did you make that choice when you could have chosen otherwise? And there are people like James Baldwin who've sort of said, maybe it's romantic to even expect otherwise from European descended Jews, but I think in many ways that's a gift. The other thing I just wanted to mention in relationship to Louis's other point was that it was interesting. I was an undergraduate at Brown in the 1990s, and there was a stark divide between white Jews who had grown up in urban centers and white Jews who'd grown up in the suburbs. And the white Jews who'd grown up in the suburbs were the ones who fit in very happily at Hillel. And the ones who grew up in the cities were the ones who tended to be involved in activist stuff that was often multiracial. And what's interesting is a lot of the urban group, I mean, in which I'd count myself, we wanted to be involved in Jewish life, but not if the condition of doing it was only being around other whites. And so there were several Jews of color who formed a Jews of color student group. And all of a sudden, all the urban white Jews came out of the woodwork too, because as far as they're concerned, they loved being Jewish, but not if that meant committing to whiteness as anti-Blackness, essentially. And so it was interesting to see what the opening up of that opportunity meant for a whole generation of people. But I would just, to add to the conversation of Israel, I mean, I would just add a couple things. I mean, one is, I've always sort of subscribed to a position within Judaism that has a long history, which is that Jews should have remained a diasporic people, that our fate was to be a people who lived in exile. And that, and that we were supposed to be a diasporic people who grappled with whatever conditions of whatever places in which we found ourselves. Of course, once there is a state of Israel, you can't, I mean, that's letting oneself off the hook too easily, because as soon as it exists, one's responsible for what it does, right? And there are, of course, people who would say, well, there needed to be an Israel because Jews needed sanctuary. But the obvious response, of course, is, why did your sanctuary have to make refugees of others? Why couldn't you function as immigrants, not as settlers, right? Which is an argument that many Native Americans make about people who came to this country. And of course, the other thing is, I was earlier waxing, sort of very positively about biblical sources, but there's a source for, genocidal settlement in the Torah as well. And there are many people who cite that as justification for what's going on now. So yeah, and I actually, I know, Jonathan, that you were qualifying some of the challenges of Black Power ways of talking about Israel as too simple. But I actually think in many ways, thinking about it as a settler colonial state along with other ones has been very, very generative for progressive activism that's transnational and very constructive.
So Thank you. Thank you all for responding. If you're up for it, we'll do one more round of discussion because there's so many interesting questions that have come in, and then we'll wrap up. So I'm going to try to pull together some of the threads that have come in, both in the chat and in all of the excellent points that you've raised. And thank you, Louis, for responding actively in the Q&A section, to the questions that have been raised, and to all of you for responding. So I want to follow up on this question about sort of perception. So we've raised a lot of points around whiteness, around whether Jews are white, Jews forming alliances. And I want to come back to something that I think Jane raised initially, which is, we're having a panel discussion here on the history of anti-Semitism. We're talking about history of persecution. We're talking about history of oppression. And one of the things that came up in the chat was a question, and I'm going to scroll up to it, where someone asked a question about that in their experiences in higher education, Black, Indigenous, people of color students reject quote unquote white Jews as identifying as anything other than white, viewing the racism that they experience as more oppressive than anti-Semitism. And that was also in response to another comment that had come in the chat about wishing that more Jews didn't try to pass as white, right? That they sort of both recognize that sort of all the things we've talked about Jewish sort of separating out the categories. But I want to talk to you, ask you to think about how this discussion of sort of a history of persecution functions in both pushing back against whiteness, and as somebody who does a lot of work in researching about the history of the Holocaust, how that sort of gives Jews a place in the American context to point to a history of oppression and persecution, and the way that functions, right, as part of this conversation, right? So to say, yes, we recognize oppression, but we too are oppressed, and it becomes embraced as a central part of an American Jewish identity that wasn't necessarily the case in the 1940s or 50s, when American Jews weren't sort of responding to Holocaust survivors in that way. So I'm wondering if you can think about and talk about how even this conversation about anti-Semitism and engaging with a history of persecution is in some way a response to Jews being perceived as too white, or pushing back against the idea that Jews are white.
I just want to give one small anecdote, and I don't, obviously people will expand on that, but one of my colleagues set out to set up a program in what ended up being called atrocity studies. And it was an expansion of a program that had been around Holocaust education, but it now was meant to include more. And I asked the question, why do all the atrocities occur in Europe when every day we see the outcome of the founding atrocities of America? We have the genocide of Native Americans who continue to live. We reside on their land at my university. We have the outcomes of slavery, which was a 400 years, genocidal project. And there wasn't really an answer. And so this idea of what counts as a genocide, that there wasn't a wish to engage that conversation, I think, in a full way. And I think maybe if I take the question that you've spun, Avi, I think there's an uncomfortableness with that feeling that if I say I have suffered greatly, that I'm somehow diminishing your experience, or vice versa. And I think that for some younger generations, not everybody by any means, a lot of what their parents did was to try to shelter them from the deep parts that could continue on. They bought their way out. And I'm talking about Black people too. My parents both had advanced degrees. We lived in a nice suburban, I call it the Brady Bunch neighborhood. So you buy your way out of that connection, that immediate connection with suffering. And then you can only tell the story through a very fine lens. And not all of us had the advantage of growing up with Jane's parents who kept that struggle and the connection to the current politics alive in their home and in their raising of their children. And so I think that people are afraid of seeing how their traumas may have informed others.
Does anybody else want to address?
I would just want to say I love Jane's parents.
Jonathan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a couple of things. It's a hard lost question to think about. What's the relationship between whiteness and is the acknowledgement of the persecution and oppression of Jews a way of sort of disavowing whiteness, or of and I think that this is complicated because of the fact that America is predominantly and hegemonically a white Christian nation. And within the history of Christianity, there is a long discourse about martyrdom, and about martyrdom being precisely the vehicle through which one testifies to one's faith in Christ. To imitate Christ is the highest acknowledgement of Christian consciousness. And the ways in which this plays out is in a kind of very distorted persecutory, not saying that word right, but you feel me, right? Like that you are persecuted, even if you are in fact the dominant hegemonic group. And I think that my comments my initial comments about looking at the history of anti-Semitism or of Judeophobia one-eyed, if you're only interested in looking at it from the perspective of what has been the experience of my people, who are the people, right? As Lewis said, I think there's a way in which, in actuality, that can be slipping into a certain kind. I think it can be slipping into a certain kind of Christian discourse. Okay, the bottom line is, one way in which we disavow whiteness is most definitely not by engaging in a competition of victimhood. And very definitely, one of the ways in which we do it is precisely what Kal suggested, which is to think about traumatic, our traumatic memory in the way that Michael Rothberg encourages us to, that it's multidirectional, and that one trauma connects to others. Jane spoke about this earlier when she said, everywhere around her in Chicago, there was disaster. It may not have been disaster that directly impacted the lives of Jews, but nonetheless, there was pain and suffering and wreckage everywhere. And that is what she was called to immediately respond to. And I think ultimately, this is the most important takeaway for me in terms of the ways in which we can move towards disavowing whiteness. Lewis used a nice phrase. I don't know if he was being intentional or not about it, but when he called it complicit whiteness. And I think the main thing is, let's not be complicit as Jews with whiteness or with white supremacy. Let's engage in a self-reflexive interrogation and attempt in our own lives to combat, disavow, dismantle, disrupt the place that we have as white Jews, if you're a white Jew like me.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jane or Louis, I don't know if you want to respond to this. I mean, one of the interesting things about sort of the function of anti-Semitism within Jewish identity, and Michael Meyer has written about this also, right? It's a, you know, it's a force that pushes Jews into their sort of identity, just as assimilation is a force that pushes them out, but it has an important function in maintaining Jewish group connectedness and identity, right? And so there is this sort of push and pull that takes place. There's so many interesting questions, but I'm also aware of the time. So there's one question that came in, and I think maybe we'll wrap up with this. And it's something that I can't remember who brought it up. The issue of sort of when you go to a doctor's office or when you fill out a form and it asks you to identify your ethnicity, right? I think it lists, you know, when we have these everywhere, and this is a very, I think, American thing, although maybe some of you can comment to this. So even on the census this year, if I'm not mistaken, right, there was a new category of, if I'm not mistaken, it was you could tick off Ashkenazi Jewish descent. So the question that came into the chat was, how do each of you respond to this question when you go into either a doctor's office or on the census or wherever it may be?
I could start so the others could finish up. It's a funny thing with me, and Jane knows this. I'm from one of the most mixed family you could ever imagine. And one of the things that's good about that is you actually know the inner lives of people. You know how they sleep, use the toilet, smell, everything. So to convince me that white, brown, or Chinese people are radically different at a basic level just doesn't work. But I bring this up because, as I said earlier, I love being a Black person. And especially if you're a jazz musician, which I am, you love it even more. But the fact of the matter is, I grew up knowing all the things I am, and they become manifested in different ways. So for instance, I'm one of those people who check Black, but always remind people that Black is a very broad category. There's a lot of Black and, just like there's Jewish and. But there's some contexts, because it's an epidemiological issue. I have rare genetic illnesses that are connected to the mixtures I am. And because of that, in certain contexts, say if I go to the physician, I have to mention that I'm part Chinese because I have a unique genetic illness that only 2% of the Northeast Asian population have. And some of my other illnesses are actually linked to, again, the parts of the world that are from people I'm from. For instance, my multiple epilepsies, the genetic diabetes, there are a lot of things. But all those things are paradoxical, because although they're afflictions, they also have been things that I also look at in a strange way as also gifts, because the challenges, what they have done is to compel me and my brothers and a lot of my family to learn how to live, struggle, and build under conditions of adversity. And this is something that's allegorical, that's linked to many of the communities we're talking about. Because although today people may have all kinds of things to talk about when they talk about Jews, the fact is a lot of Jewish history is a history of adversity. And it's the same thing, although what a lot of people don't understand is that what led to the construction of Black people as a negative category has created a history of asphyxiation and adversity that it's just a fact that Black people have fought that through building resilience from art to food to thought that affirm life. And this is something that is what connects me when I think of Judaism in its positive way, which is that it's also about the affirmation of life. So when I check boxes, I check the boxes as truthfully as I can. Even when I say hello, I don't deny that I'm also a Tamil Indian, that I'm also a Palestinian Jew, and that I'm also, a Sephardic Jew of Irish descent. I don't deny that. But what I don't do is to try to make those identities make me special or better than the communities to which I belong. They're just, for me, simply factual connections that link me to a community. And this is now a different use of privilege. It's just a fact internal to Judaism that if you're linked to certain communities within Judaism, you do have certain privileges in terms of how you could do things in religious practices like Bia the Bima, etc. That's a fact. But within it, the struggle is to deal with what it is, what are the elements in my Black, Jewish, or Tamil identity that will connect to the question of fighting for what is right. And the last thing I just want to say is, it's one of the reasons why when I go to India, I fundamentally connect with the Dalits, because the Dalits deal with a lot of the issues that we're talking about now. The Dalits are critical about how we talk about integration and assimilation. Because for the Dalits, the integration was to bring them all in the ambit of Brahminic control. But the problem is the assimilation under Hinduism structures Dalits as untouchable. So there are forms of assimilating that are dehumanizing. And one of the problems in the United States, similarly, integration means Black people are under the rule of the governing practice of the US, but assimilation is defined in terms of white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. And that creates a certain problem, because it means if the assimilation is premised upon the illegitimacy of such a life-affirming part of what we are as Black people or as Jewish people. Anyway, that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Louis. Who wants to go next? Both what you check off and also sort of concluding thoughts on everything that we've discussed.
I'll go next, because I'm going to be very brief in response to this and let other people make the concluding thoughts. I just want to, I don't like checking these boxes. I also tried to do so honestly, but I do so very thoughtfully about when it is important that we insert ourselves into racial categories. I mean, one of the ways in which checking the box white is relevant, it has to do with the history of affirmative action and why it exists in order to rectify, past injustices. When I can, I check the box marked other. There is oftentimes a box marked other, and sometimes you get to fill in the blanks when it comes to that. And I think, again, I think ultimately all of us ought to be checking the box other. We all need to sort of get in touch with otherness, and at the same time become more aware of the ways in which otherness is itself been constructed historically differently in different places in different times. So that's how I check the boxes.
I want Kal to have the last word, so I'm going to go next, if that's okay, Kal. Is that all right? So when I was thinking about this question, I was actually thinking about how rarely I'm asked at the doctor's office about race. I mean, the only time I could actually think of it was specifically at the OBGYN, right? Because there's a clear correlation between Ashkenazi women and a predisposition for certain kinds of breast cancer. So that was the only time I was asked for that. But something that struck me as interestingly related, just in terms of living in the US right now, was Louis and I were briefly part of this this monitoring thing that watched what we viewed. And we as one family represented 1,000 viewers. So we tried to watch as much Black programming as possible. But the problem is we just don't watch that much TV. So they lost interest in us. But they had this very detailed census information. But what was really interesting was if you answered that you were white, it didn't ask about immigration status. Whereas if you said you were a person of color, it immediately asked about immigration status. Because we were saying, Lewis and I are both immigrants. Why aren't I being asked about my immigrant status? But it's because I'd answered white to the initial questions. It was just interesting in thinking about contemporary politics. But the thing I was just thinking in terms of what Jonathan was saying was, I've had the experience multiple times of taking our children to the doctor, right? And so if I were to check, it'd be very straightforward. You know, it's simple. But our kids share everything that Lewis is. So I'm sort of constantly checking loads of boxes. And the interesting thing has been seeing what gets imputed to their diversity when it comes to certain genetic things. So we have 2 Black daughters, right? And the younger of them, for whom I'm the biological mother, developed very quickly. And I remember a nurse explaining to me, well, you know, because she's Black, she developed very quickly. And I had to explain that that came very directly from me, you know? And so it was interesting just seeing sort of how the administration of that data interacts with what it is that people sort of ascribe to it. But I guess my sort of take on it has been a little bit different than yours, Jonathan, which is just, I know that in the US, in a lot of contexts, I'm a white person. And there are all kinds of things for which I'm not, there aren't obstacles presented before me for that reason. I know there are other places where I seem like a really funny looking white person, and you know, but that's very different from not being a white person. And so I always sort of figure for administrative purposes, it's very clear that that's what I am. And how I live that is something radically different that they're not asking me for on those forms. So, and thank you, Avi, for this discussion.
Well,
Go ahead,
thank
Kal.
you, Jane. Get the senior pass. I mean, I started off, I was going to say something very simple. I, like Lewis, am proud of being Black. I mean, as I said, I grew up in the time when there was a transition between being a Negro and being Black and proud. That was the context in my house growing up, the move between Sidney Poitier and James Brown. And so on the one hand, it seems a simple question, but I think it also goes back to the very beginning of this conversation. I think it's vital politically and socially, not just individually, how I feel about myself or feel about my identity. When Black women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth, when one of the great follows that I have on Twitter is a doctor named Kimberly Manning, who works at Grady Medical, which is the city hospital in Atlanta. She's a Black physician, and she talks a lot about the medical racism that is embedded. She teaches at Emory Med School, where I have a daughter who graduated from that school, where it's embedded in the education of doctors to treat Black people differently, to assume, as you said, Jane, that we continue to be corporeally and physiognomically different from all other creatures in a way that means that we should be treated with cruelty and dehumanization. And so, not just in the doctor's office, but on the census and every place else, I think it's important for people like myself to continue to affirm the message that we are here, and that we are surviving, that we are capable of participating in all the ways that other humans are participating in the world we live in, and that our presence actually makes things better.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you really for just a fascinating, wide-ranging discussion that probably leaves us with even more questions than we had before coming in, which is probably sort of the best type of conversation to discussion, which will hopefully spur us to continue exploring these categories. It's really been fascinating since we first conceived of this, and I want to thank Lewis for the partnership and co-sponsoring this, and also thinking about how to put this panel together tonight, which was really incredibly fascinating. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors tonight, the UConn Philosophy Department, El Instituto, the Africana Studies Institute, Dodd Human Rights Impact for co-sponsoring and sharing the Conover Zoomatorium with us, and the Office of Global Affairs for co-sponsoring this program. And I really want to thank all of you for wonderful panelists bringing diverse, fascinating, different backgrounds and viewpoints to this conversation. There's so many other things I'd love to continue to discuss, and maybe we'll continue this conversation as we go forward. So thank you, Kal and Jane and Louis and Jonathan, for a wonderful program. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight for this program. Have a good night, be well, stay healthy, stay safe, and everything will get better. Thank you.